Hi everybody, this is Dr. Johnson, and this lecture is going to be talking about lipids. Lipids is a fancy terminology for fat. I'll most likely say fat throughout the PowerPoint. It's a little bit easier to say. By the end of this lecture, you should be able to identify the lipids found in our foods, distinguish the types of lipids based off of chemical structure, and explain lipoproteins. So when we look at fat in our food, 25 to 35% of our total calories should be coming from fat. Now that may seem like a lot, but fat has a lot of very important functions in our body. Fat helps create the cell membrane around every single cell in our body. It helps to protect our vital organs. It plays a role in hormone signaling. And it also is required for us to absorb our fat-soluble vitamins, which are A, D, E, and K, or ADEC for short. Without fat present, our body doesn't have the ability to absorb vitamins A, D, E, and K. This is why fat actually has a lower range requirement with the acceptable macronutrient range compared to protein. Protein is 10 to 35%, but fat, the minimum percentage of our total calories, should be 25%. When we classify fatty acids, we're classifying them based off of their carbon chain. So down here is the carbon structure, and this determines how the fatty acid operates, especially when we're looking at absorption. Fatty acids are different in chain length, and they're always by 2 carbons. So a short chain fatty acid is anything from 2 to 4 carbons. A medium chain fatty acid is 6 to 10 carbons, and a long chain fatty acid is 12 or more carbons. Now, this is important because we absorb them differently, which I'll talk about in just a second. One thing to note is that short chain fatty acids are not that prevalent in our food. It's only found in milk fat, and it's the main fatty acid that's produced by gut bacteria. In fact, they believe that the mechanism of action is that the gut bacteria can be protective when it produces this butyric from eating fiber. That's actually what it produces from eating the fiber in our foods. Now, one thing that's really gotten popular are medium chain triglycerides, and that would fall into this category. Now, it's important to understand that coconut oil tends to be marketed as having a lot of medium chain triglycerides. However, most of the carbon length chains in coconut oil are 12 or more carbons, and therefore you're not going to get the same quick absorption. What do I mean by absorption? Well, because long chain fatty acids have so many carbons, we have to package them into lipoproteins. Whereas short chain fatty acids and medium chain fatty acids are absorbed directly into the small intestine, into the bloodstream. So, for example, if this is your bloodstream right here, what we actually do is, if this is your gut, the blue, those small chain fatty acids go straight through and they get absorbed directly into the bloodstream. Whereas the long chain fatty acids have to be packaged into lipoproteins. So here, this is when we package them, we break them down. So this long carbon chain gets broken down into an individual fatty acid. We package them up into a lipoprotein, and then it gets absorbed and the lipoprotein goes into the bloodstream. There's a completely separate video that talks about this process that you'll need to know. So let's look at fatty acid structure. So that was how we classify them based off of the number of carbons on the chain, so chain length. But now fatty acid structure, it's either saturated. So here's an example of the carbon chain, and there is a hydrogen on every carbon. So that means it's saturated. We also have unsaturated. We have 2 different categories of unsaturated, either monounsaturated, which I like to call MUFAs, or polyunsaturated, which I like to call PUFAs. Now, notice the difference between the unsaturated fatty acid and the saturated. What is that difference? Right, so you can see there's a double bond here between these two carbons, and therefore it's bent, right? That actual structure of the fatty acid then becomes bent, and that gives it a more fluid and not as rigid of movement. So an unsaturated MUFA would be one double bond, so this is an example of a MUFA, whereas a PUFA would have maybe another double bond right here, depends on what carbon number it's on, whether it's considered what we would call an omega-3, 6, or 9. Now, trans fat is this little guy down here. So what do you notice with the chemical structure with a trans fat? Right, it has a double bond here, but it's also still kind of a pseudo-saturated, and that's because trans fats have been hydrogenated. So what they've done is they've actually come in here and they've hydrogenated the saturated fat to make it behave more like an unsaturated fat. I'm sorry, they hydrogenated unsaturated to make it more like a saturated fat. So for example, a vegetable oil is typically unsaturated, but then they hydrogenate it and you make margarine. So it behaves more rigid and stuck. Now, when we're looking at these fatty acids, if this hexagon was your bloodstream, which one do you think is going to move through more challenging? It's hard to tell from this picture, but trans fat is going to. So trans fat is really bad for us, and we don't want to have hardly any in our trans fat. If more optimal is 0 grams, but less than 5 grams per day is optimal. So here's a different picture of triglycerides. So this is going to be your saturated fatty acids. You can see it's very stiff and rigid. And then you have your unsaturated here where you start to get the kinks and the bends. So this is a poly right here, this strand. You can see there's a double bond here, and a double bond here. This is a mono where there's just the one double bond there. Typically, your unsaturated fats are things like liquids at room temperature because of the double bonds. And then your saturated are things that are more solid at room temperature, like your butter, your cheese, and so forth. That's not always the case, but it's kind of an easy rule of thumb. There are a few exceptions. One thing to note is that most of the time saturated fat is coming from animal foods, minus coconut oil and palmitic oil. And then unsaturated fatty acids is typically coming from your plant-based foods, things like your olive oils, nut oils, and then the one exception is your fatty fish like salmon. So some food sources, again, saturated is going to be dominantly from your animal proteins, so things like steak, chicken, beef, the egg yolk, your cheese, whole fat milk. Salmon is the exception. I just couldn't find a better picture. Unsaturated is going to be your plant-based foods, so things like avocado, olive oil, nuts, peanut butter, and then one exception, like I said, is that salmon. And then trans fat are things that are highly processed. So if you look at now, it's not allowed anymore to have trans fat in our peanut butter. Or if you look at like Coffee Mate, it's going to say hydrogenated oils. That is signaling for trans fat. So again, we dominantly categorize on that previous slide what type of fat it is based off of what type of fatty acid structure there is. So saturated is the red, your PUFA is your blue and your orange, and then your MUFA is your yellow. Now, in the United States, we tend to get plenty of the linoleic acid and the saturated fat. However, we significantly lack alpha linolenic acid, which is our omega-3 fatty acid, and our oleic acid, which is a MUFA. So you can see here why a lot of people talk about why olive oil is so important and healthy and it has good health benefits. That's because 75% of the fatty acid found in olive oil is actually oleic acid, which is a type of monounsaturated fatty acid. Whereas, again, butter, a lot of people will say, butter's not good for you, and that's because it has a lot of saturated fat in it. Well, there's 68% of the fatty acid found in butter is coming from saturated. But let's look at the very popular coconut oil right now. Coconut oil was having a moment a couple years ago. It started to die off with the craze. However, some people still believe it's a really beneficial fat. I like to point out that 91% of that fatty acid in coconut oil is saturated. So, this is why it's important to not have just one type of fat in our diets, but to make sure that we have a wide variety of fat in our diet, because the dietary guidelines recommend that we have less than 10%. So, less than 10% of our diet should be saturated fat, and then the remainder of that 25 to 35% should be the polyunsaturated and the monounsaturated. So let's look at trans fat. So here's an example, this food label here. This is the older one. They have been updated since, and they're still in that transition. But you can see that it says 0 grams trans fat. Now the problem with this is that they're allowed to have a certain percentage until they have to put it on the label. So we need to go look at the ingredient list for partially hydrogenated oils. When we go to that ingredient list, first of all, you can see that sugar is the very first ingredient, meaning that there's more sugar than any other product in this particular package. Oops, this actually should be down here. I apologize. And here you can see the fancy words, partially hydrogenated palm kernel. Palm kernel is a type of oil. So there is trans fat in here because it's partially hydrogenated oil. So again, this is why it's important to read our food labels, specifically the ingredient list. Now, when we're looking at fatty acids, there are a lot of different fatty acids, which I'll show you a slide in just one second. But the two that our body cannot synthesize, so our body actually has the ability to make fatty acids. However, there are two that it cannot, which are alpha linolenic acid, or ALA for short, and then linolenic acid, which is omega-6 and then omega-3. Now, it's only titled omega-3 and omega-6 based off of where the double bond is on what carbon. However, it should be noted that Americans have no problem getting adequate omega-6 in the form of linoleic acid. However, we do significantly lack getting enough omega-3 and the ALA, but also two other types, which I'll show you. Some food sources, omega-3s, fatty fish, olive oil, flaxseed for some examples, and then the linoleic acid are things like your seeds, nuts, and vegetable oils. Primarily, people are eating a lot of processed foods in the United States, and so that vegetable oil is how they're able to get adequate linoleic acid, but we really do need to try to focus on incorporating more omega-3s in our diet. There are two other types of omega-3 fatty acids. These are not essential, however, they are highly important for our health, which is DHA and EPA. So our body actually can make DHA and EPA from ALA. The problem is most people are not consuming a high enough amount of ALA in order for the body to then synthesize EPA and DHA. So it's super important that we get EPA and DHA in our diet because it helps with our brains, it helps with our skin, it helps with our eyes, it helps with decreasing chronic diseases such as Alzheimer's, cancers, cardiovascular disease. There's a lot of health benefits that are documented. And EPA and DHA are coming dominantly from fatty fish. So this is an example of different types of monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, and all of the other fatty acids. So one thing to note is that we do have quite a few, these are all the black here are all these different fatty acids, and actually the fatty acids that we can make in our body. Okay, so each of these little arrows means that it's a process and we can then go and make that. But I do want to note that the EPA and the DHA here are coming dominantly from the oil in fatty fish and then some of the marine algae. However, that is really expensive and kind of hard to find, and also not a lot of people are consuming that food. So those are the types of fatty acids in our food, and they are in the form of triglycerides, which is also a type of lipid that is found within our bodies. We also see phospholipids, and we see sterols and lipoproteins. Again, there's a completely separate video that talks about lipoproteins. So let's look at triglycerides first. Triglycerides is the largest category of lipids found in both our diet and our food. They're all going to be the same chemical structure, minus the fact that this individual fatty acid could be different. They could be all saturated, they could be all unsaturated. However, every triglyceride is going to have this glycerol backbone and then 3 individual fatty acids. So this is 1, this is 2, and this is 3. Now, what's the difference between the fatty acid 1, 2, and 3? Number 1 is saturated. Number 2 is a MUFA, so there's 1 double bond here. And then number 3 is a PUFA, so there's 3 double bonds. 1, 2, 3 double bonds. Now, it's important because whatever our diet is largely of, that's how we're going to make triglycerides in our body. So it's really interesting. We eat triglycerides in our food. We break them down into this individual fatty acid, and then we repackage them into triglycerides in our body. That's in the other video that you can watch. So this is, again, dependent on the type of diet that we're consuming. Phospholipids. So phospholipids are part of that phospholipid bilayer on our cells. So this is that picture right here. And then it protects all of our cells. It basically, that fat helps keep things inside the cell that need to stay inside, and then keeps things outside the cell that need to be outside. We make phospholipids in our body. We do not need to consume them in our diet. They're not that dominant in our diet either, but there is a small amount of phospholipids found in eggs, liver, and soybeans. Sterols are a very small percentage of our dietary fat, and the most abundant is cholesterol. Now, it's important to note that dietary cholesterol is only in animal products. So if you are vegan, that means you are not consuming any dietary cholesterol. However, your body does make cholesterol, and so you could still have high cholesterol. It used to say that we should lower the amount of dietary cholesterol in our bodies, but now they're recognizing that it is actually more about the type of fat in our bodies, not the type of cholesterol in our food. So we need to focus on consuming more of those unsaturated versus saturated. Sterols are used for sex hormones to make them, vitamin D absorption, bile salts, which helps us break down fat, and then also some of our adrenal hormones. We also have lipoproteins. So lipoproteins share similar characteristics. They all have a lipid core. Now, that lipid core is a combination of triglycerides and cholesterol, but the balance is going to change. So you can see down here, this is mostly green, which is your triglyceride, with just a little bit of yellow, which is cholesterol. And then as we move over to HDL, you can see it's all cholesterol with just a little bit of triglycerides. Okay, but each of these lipoproteins have both at the center. They're surrounded by phospholipids. So that outer layer, which is the blue ring, that's your phospholipid. And then we have proteins embedded on that outer edge. So you can see that chylomicron has like 1 protein, but HDL has a lot of protein, right? Well, that's because it's called high density lipoprotein, so it has a higher amount of protein in it. I should note here, there's another video that explains chylomicron, VLDL, LDL, and HDL, and the entire process of breaking down the fat in our food to then getting them and then traveling throughout our body that you'll need to watch. So pause the video really fast and identify the 3 categories for fatty acid structure, the 3 categories for fatty acid chain length, and then the types of lipids found in our diet. So pause this video and fill out your flowchart. And here is what you should have. So, in conclusion, the primary type of fatty acid determines the type of fat, whether it's saturated or unsaturated. And we should shift our focus on consuming more unsaturated fats because we have better health benefits, and less than 10% of our total calories should be saturated.